So hello, my name is Rita Larkin. I'm the Communications Director for the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation. Thank you for joining us for our first webinar of 2022. We're very happy to be here. And one of the reasons we're so happy to be here is this also happens to be the 25th anniversary of the foundation. We're so grateful to the supporters who have gotten us to this milestone. So thank you. I'm sure many of you have been donors and supporters of the foundation for a very long time. We're happy to be here to discuss parkway vegetation trends with Alexa Viets. Alexa is the Chief of Resource Management and Interpretation for the Parkway. She leads a team of 19 permanent staff of interpreters, cultural resource managers, natural resource scientists, and planning and design professionals. On top of that, she oversees 20 to 25 seasonal interpretive rangers and Parkway Visitor Center operations. So she has a very big role with the Park Service, and she has a lot of information for us today to get you in tune with what we're seeing in park visitation. So Alexa, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Rita. And it's great to be here. I think before I jump into the presentation, I just want to point out one important caveat, and that is in the description that Rita gave of my roles and responsibilities, you'll note that it didn't say social scientist, because I am not a social scientist. In fact, in graduate school, the one requirement that I managed to weasel my way out of was statistics. So please take everything with a grain of salt and understand that I just want to share with you some, I would say, top line kind of takeaways from a handful of reports that I have been looking through and tracking, and the data that we're looking at as park managers, to kind of share a big picture with you all about the trends as best as we can glean them and to start a conversation. So with that, I will jump right in and share with you what we have found. So I want to start by pointing out that the annual recreation visits for the park, and this is preliminary data, but the annual recreation visits for the park are already showing what we have sort of been hearing anecdotally from our field staff, and that is a pretty big spike even during the pandemic. So for 2021, you can see there on the chart, just under 16 million visitors. And over the course of the last handful of years, you can see we've been hovering right around that 15 to 16 million recreational visits, kind of that midpoint there. So the question really becomes, what do we know about these visitors, what they're doing when they're in the park, what are their behavior patterns, what are their use patterns of the park? And that's surprisingly a difficult question to answer. One of the reasons is that we actually don't have a lot of detailed data about our park visitors in terms of demographics and use patterns. But one of the things that we can look at is larger data about visitation patterns to parks and tourism and travel to kind of get an understanding of what we think we might be seeing. So one of the reports that I wanted to share with you all today is called the Comprehensive Survey of the American Public. And this is a survey that the Park Service actually does. They did the last survey just after the Park Service's 100th anniversary in 2018. And that data is starting to be released now, and you can find some of those reports online. And if you look at that data specifically for the Southeast region of the country, this graphic shows you what are some of the primary reasons that people reported were important or very important and why they were choosing to visit a national park. So this is data specifically for people who have visited a national park in the last couple of years. And what you can see is, not surprisingly, they're looking for that outdoor recreation experience. They're wanting to spend time with friends and family. They wanted to just visit a national park, maybe check that off of a bucket list. And they also wanted to learn more about history and nature. Those are the compelling reasons for their visits. You can dive a little bit deeper to understand visitation patterns if you look at regional data. This is from the Asheville Visitors Bureau as well as the Virginia Tourism Corporation. And what this shows us is among the top reasons for people's travel, again, it was outdoor recreational experiences and sort of sightseeing and cultural experiences. You can see that for Asheville, that was number 2 and 3. For Virginia, it was flipped. The Asheville survey is actually specifically asked if visiting a national park was one of the reasons for travel. And you can see that made among the top 5 responses for their survey group as well. Across the board, most of the time, whether it was the regional data or the national data, number 1 reasons for travel tended to be to visit family and friends. But you can see these 2 groups of outdoor recreational experiences and cultural tourism were closely behind. I just wanted to also note, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, Virginia in particular, and really I think Asheville is doing this as well, but Virginia has made a very concerted marketing push to reach that outdoor tourism market. And I think that we're going to see later in the presentation that those kinds of marketing efforts are paying off. They recently announced just in the last couple of days that the women's pro cycling team is relocating their base of operations from Idaho to Virginia's Blue Ridge, which I thought was a particularly great announcement and reflects, I think, an overall trend that we're seeing here regionally as well. So let's dive a little bit deeper into these 2 buckets of visitors, the recreational visitors and the cultural tourism visitors. I'm going to start with cultural tourism, which is unfortunately an area that's a little less clear in terms of the trends, but I'll share with you some of what I've found. Most of the reports that look at this type of tourism or travel trends point toward an overall downward trend in interest in cultural tourism, unfortunately. There's a group called Impacts Experience, which is a research group that specifically focuses on data associated with this kind of travel and tourism, looking at museums and zoos and historic sites. And in a presentation that they recently hosted for the National Park Service staff, the researchers framed the problem as one of negative substitution. Essentially, what's happening is that the existing base of older and more mature visitors to historic sites and cultural sites were participating at high rates. And as they move out of the market, the younger generation is not participating at those same higher rates. And the researchers for this report really point toward the issue of perceptions of relevance, that for a younger generation, these sites may not seem as relevant to them personally. They may not understand or see the connections to their own lives in the stories that are being told or sites that are being preserved. So that's a real challenge that I think we need to pay attention to. Specifically, for example, this report noted that while the millennial generation equals 27% of the US population, they're only participating at a rate of about 23% in tourism to these kinds of sites. So that's just a specific example. Whereas by contrast, the baby boomers and the older generations were participating and visiting at rates equal to or even exceeding their relative percentage of the overall population. So this problem of negative substitution is one that we may be facing. I do want to note that this, as I said, this market or this portion of tourism and travel, the data out there is maybe not quite as consistent. So on the right, you'll see from a report that was done by FICOR, which is a Federal Interagency Council on Outdoor Recreation. They did a study in 2009. So this is pre-pandemic and a little bit older, but their data covered a wide range of recreation and sort of tourist activity. And they actually showed spikes in things like sightseeing and cultural tourism. Some other studies that I've looked at also showed increases in interest in things like outdoor cultural experiences like concerts, which is certainly consistent with what we've seen in terms of the strong interest and numbers at the Music Center with the support of the foundation's operation. So again, this picture may not be quite as clear. And I think the takeaway here is it's something that we're going to need to continue to look into and try and understand better in terms of park management. We can look, however, at some park-specific data that we have for the Moses Cone site, which I think is kind of an interesting example. This chart shows that in the last 6 or 7 years, the trend of visitation, or maybe more specifically visitor contacts, which I'll explain in a minute, has been relatively flat around 60 to 65,000 visitor contacts annually. And when I say that, what I mean is those are the number of visitors that our Park Service rangers have engaged directly. So it doesn't necessarily include individuals who maybe went into the gift shop or bought something at the bookstore. This is about direct contact with park staff. You can see on the graph, there's a pretty interesting spike there in 2019. And in talking that over with our supervisory park ranger, Tina White, for that area, I think what we've concluded is that in 2018 and 2019, a couple of things came into play. First, many of you may know there was a really phenomenal art exhibit in Blowing Rock that specifically focused on the art collection of the Cone sisters, or rather the nieces. So, you know, the interest in the site, in the story, spiked overall during that time period. I think that's probably a major component there. The other is we actually had funding from the foundation beginning, I think, in 2018 to fund a shoulder season of staffing. In other words, we were able to have staff or park rangers out on site for a longer season than we previously had in the past. So they were really able to engage that increasing number of visitors who might be coming in the spring and late fall in a way that we hadn't before. So that's really exciting to see that kind of engagement and what happens when those kinds of investments and opportunities exist. You can see during the pandemic, the contacts took a pretty big dip there, but in 2021, we're seeing this spike even in the cultural tourism arena of sort of coming back up to what I would consider pre-pandemic levels. So, you know, as I said before, the picture on cultural tourism is a little bit harder to get a clear picture around, but it's interesting to see that the data in Moses Cone, with the exception of the 2019 window, has had this sort of somewhat flat trajectory. So I want to shift now and talk a little bit about recreational tourism and recreational visitors. And that picture, I think we are seeing, is more clear overall. So when you look at overall trends in recreation, one of the things that I looked at was information from the campground industry. And this is a chart from a report that the National Park Service actually commissioned to examine campground utilization and understand the trends so that the Park Service could be informed about decisions around investments in campgrounds, modernization, that type of thing. And in the chart, you'll see from 2014 to 2018, the total number of overnight camping trips increased by more than 8.2 million. So that's pretty significant. And the largest growth of that segment was this multiple trips or 3 times a year kind of segment you see in the gray portion of that bar, which I think is particularly interesting. The researchers for this report really pointed again toward exiting campers. The mature campers and baby boomers are actually being replaced by new campers in the younger generation. So what that's saying is not only is the younger generation coming in, but they may be camping more frequently and for a larger number of nights than previous generations. Particularly when you think about the millennial generation, which is the largest in history, what kind of influence that may be having already on the camping trends and recreation trends in parks. One of the other studies that I looked at, as I mentioned, was a report that this multi-agency group FICOR did in 2016, and they actually had some interesting information about hiking and other kinds of outdoor recreational experiences as well. So according to that report, again, this is in a pre-pandemic window leading up to a time frame that we're currently in, but in terms of long-term trends now, From 1999 to 2009, day hiking spiked by 15%. That was a marked increase. And there were even larger increases noted in the report for things like photography, nature photography. They saw a 29% increase in that activity, and birding saw a 22, almost 23% increase in interest in that 10-year period. So this overall picture that we're seeing about outdoor recreation is fairly consistently in an uphill trajectory. This chart is from a report by the Outdoor Foundation. And what it shows is that in 2020, 106.7 million Americans over the age of 6 participated in at least one outdoor activity. And that's 7.1 million more than in 2019. That's a lot of families and picnickers and hikers and individuals out there on the trails. I think, again, anecdotally, we're hearing a lot of reports about high levels of use in the last couple of years. And this information is really supporting that. Overall, what this chart represents is that 53% of the US population in that age group is participating in an outdoor activity in 2020. So that's pretty significant and pretty interesting. When you compare that to data at the park level, I think we're finding that is consistent as well. So this, for example, is just a snapshot of our campground use on the Parkway. You can see the picture from 2014 on, and 2014 was really that moment that we were getting out of the sequestration era when a number of government facilities, including some campgrounds, were even shut down due to budget constraints. And so as campgrounds were coming back online, we were also moving many of these campgrounds to an online reservation system that was nationwide. And so we're seeing across this chart this kind of slow rise going on and increasing engagement in campground use on a sort of positive trend. Then it takes a major dip again with the pandemic in 2020. We actually had some campgrounds that were closed during 2020, as with some of our visitor centers. But in 2021, with the reopening of all of those campgrounds, we saw this same consistent spike that we're seeing in these other reports as well around recreation use. Over the whole window of 2014 to 2021, when you include overnight stays in our lodges, backcountry camping, things of that nature, the park actually saw a 56% increase between 2014 and 2021 in overnight stays. So again, very consistently seeing these increasing trends. One last thing I want to point out about this chart before I move on, and that is, if you look closely at the specific campgrounds, in particular, you can see increases in those places that are nearby population centers. So Pisgah and the Crabtree campgrounds for the Asheville area, and Price Park for Blowing Rock area. I think that's a particularly noteworthy thing. It's probably pretty sort of obvious to say that people are going to go places that might be close to home during the pandemic, but the data really bears that out in an important way. And when we talk about spreading out visitor use and responsible recreation, I think that's an important point to not overlook. So the last thing that I want to show you in terms of trying to understand what we're really seeing at the park level is our visitor contact data. So again, this is about the number of visitors that we're engaging specifically just in the visitor centers. In the blue line, you have sort of your pre-pandemic baseline of visitor engagement in 2019. You can see in the orange line in 2020, that took a pretty big hit. As I mentioned, we had some visitor centers that didn't reopen in 2020. We were able to reopen more and staff more of those locations in 2021. And so you can see kind of a return in the gray line to those pre-pandemic levels and the pattern sort of coming back online. Well, what I think is particularly interesting to me about this data is, again, think back to that first slide where we had total recreation visits to the park, almost 16 million. It's a number we haven't seen in a number of years here at the Parkway. When you compare that to the number of individuals who might be engaging at visitor centers, and we see that as a lower figure than the 2019, I think we can infer and start to take away an understanding that while we may have more visitors to the park, their patterns may have shifted. They may not be doing the things that they might have traditionally been doing in the past. And some of that has to do with access, limited access to facilities or spaces that remain closed. But overall, I think it underscores this point that we're seeing a spike in recreational activity in the park. So the question, I think, really becomes then, do we anticipate that these trends are going to continue, and how do we respond to those shifts? The data here, I think, is interesting. Most of the reports that I looked at indicated there may be some percentage of those new visitors or recreation visitors, more likely, who may not continue that activity after the pandemic. So the Outdoor Foundation published a report that indicated that new participants, as we said before, were primarily looking for those activities that they could do outside. They were socially distanced, things that were an easy lift for them, like hiking, running, and walking in the park. They did those things, as we all did, to reduce fatigue and stay healthy and get exercise and spend time with loved ones in a safe way. However, that same report, which indicated that 7.1 million new outdoor recreation participants, that about a quarter of those people reported that they don't plan to continue those activities after the pandemic. Another report that I looked at from Penn State, it was a consortium between Penn State, University of Montana, and the Leave No Trace organization, concluded similarly that about 83% of respondents were likely to continue their outdoor activities. So again, that leaves somewhere in that 20 to 25% of new participants that are kind of raising the flag to say, maybe, maybe not. Interestingly, even before the pandemic, the report that the Park Service commissioned looking at camping activity actually indicated a similar trend of sort of flagging this question of retention of new campers. So from 2015 to 2018, you can see the retention is, on a rise there from 70% all the way up to 78%. But from 2018 to 2019, the report indicated a pretty precipitous drop. So the question really becomes, do we think these new user groups will continue their pattern of use? Who are they and how do we engage them? That, I think, conclusively across the board was raised, as a question among all of these studies in terms of, what the impact of the pandemic might be on visitation. So what does it all mean? What are the takeaways that we can glean from this, or that I can glean from this in my non-social scientist chair, trying to understand how to be a responsible park manager and respond to all this information? And I think first in my mind is this point that I made about the potential, what I'll call recalibration of the new users versus returning users. The Outdoor Foundation data that I looked at pointed toward a shift that may have occurred during the pandemic of what they called devoted users versus new users. And essentially what that report was saying was that devoted users who may have been people who were avid hikers, who routinely hiked and went out and recreated and parked, camped, etc., they might have actually reduced some of their participation during that pandemic period because maybe they were feeling somewhat pushed out. Obviously, we don't know all of the reasons behind those choices, but the gap was filled by these new users. And I kind of have to wonder whether or not we might see some recalibration after the pandemic with some of those new users dropping out and some of the quote devoted users coming back. So I think that's a shift potentially that we're going to want to pay attention to. The second takeaway that I had was that several reports highlighted the fact that many people who are participating, as I said, were doing so close to home. They were looking for experiences within 10 miles of their home. For a lot of national parks in very remote areas, that may not have resulted in a spike for them, but the parkway is uniquely situated, passing through so many communities and population centers. And so I think the takeaway there is that not only did we become a place for potentially greater connection to the local communities, that's an opportunity for us as well in terms of connection and building those relationships with new local users in a way that many national parks may not have that same opportunity, being closely located to communities the way that we are. And finally, I think, and this is probably the biggest takeaway from my perspective, is that no matter whether you're looking at the cultural tourism market and those visitors who may be going to historic sites, or if you're looking at the outdoor recreation users, the reports are pretty consistently pointing to the influence and impact that the younger generations are already having on those visitation trends and those use patterns, or in their absence are having because we're not reaching them and they may not be visiting the parks or the historic sites in the same way. I think this is a particularly important point. It's something that Park Service and park managers and supporters have been talking about for a number of years. This is actually not a new challenge, really, but what the information that we're seeing, I think, coming out of the pandemic and in recent studies really just underscores the important influence that those groups are already having or currently having on park experiences and on their resources. So what do we take away from that? Where do we go from here? I think for the public, it's increasingly important that we recognize that we need to leave no trace and that we practice good principles of stewardship when we're visiting the park, because increasingly those spaces, those trails and picnic areas and campgrounds are being shared with more and more users, in particularly close to urban population centers. So we really need everyone's help to make sure that we recreate responsibly. For park managers, I think the takeaway really comes down to this call to action of really engaging that younger generation and understanding better how they're already influencing and shaping new visitor patterns in the park, and thinking hard about the management decisions we make in response to those kinds of visitation patterns and engaging that young audience in things like recreating responsibly. So with that, I will stop. I would love to have a discussion and hear any questions that anyone has about the presentation.
Great, thank you, Alexa. That's a lot of great information for folks who are interested in learning who they were seeing on the parkway, and if indeed they weren't just imagining that there were more people on the trails or more people at the campgrounds when they were there themselves. We did have one question that I wanted to pose to you, and it says, do you think the under-resourced maintenance of the park from campground areas to view sheds might also impact whether people plan to return for either outdoor or cultural recreation activities?
That's a great question. I didn't see a lot of really specific data that asked about or probed this issue in terms of what I'll call quality of experience, right? So if you have a new user, what's their expectation for the quality of experience they're going to have? But I think that's a really important question because it gets to the heart of this issue. If we want to retain and really connect to those new users who may not be familiar with park resources or what to expect, that's something that we need to face head on. I also know that obviously the role that the foundation play and others in helping us to reach those folks and help educate them is particularly important. So it's a great question. I don't have any good data to be able to answer it, unfortunately, but there's so many places that are looking into this information. I'm sure we can find something.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to say this kind of addresses that question, is that the foundation itself, to ensure that people are still getting those great outdoor experiences, created the Trails and Views Forever program. So we work on repairing trails, campgrounds, picnic areas that are seeing kind of the age take their toll, and also clearing overlooks. And so if you're interested in learning more about that program, you can visit trailsandviews.org. So we want to be respectful of folks' time. We're just a little bit over, but if you did send in a question, we will put an answer in our email to you that's going to come out with the link to the recording of the webinar. And we'll also send out the links that you have seen popping up throughout the presentation in the chat box. So with that, I would like to say thank you for joining us, and we will see you again next month. Stay tuned to our events calendar for the next topic and the next date. Thank you.